In Dark Souls 1, the Age of Ancients was surpassed, and the Age of Fire began. In Dark Souls 2, the world is caught between light and dark, unable to move on. And in Dark Souls 3, I think we'll break the cycle, and see what lies beyond light and dark. What's up guys, let's talk about some lore, specifically the clues we've seen in Dark Souls 3 so far, and what they could indicate about the direction of the story. Let's get into it. So the first thing we need to address is the timeline. Where are we within it? And right from the very beginning, we see things that are baffling from a timeline perspective. Even if you're somewhat familiar with the lore, these next few things should raise questions with you. There are ancient dragons, there's an Anor Londo giant here, there's this building that looks like Anor Londo, and it also looks like the Dragon Shrine, the castle is full of hollows, the player character doesn't hollow, and the Lords of Cinder are coming back to life. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to digest here, but we can break it down. Before we do that though, I think it's important that we're all on the same page. You can skip this if you like. Dark Souls 1 showed us the Grey Age of Ancients, and then a progression to an Age of Fire that was destined to fade until only dark remained. But Gwyn sacrificed himself to link the fire, preventing his Age of Fire from ending. Dark Souls 2 taught us that this was the first sin, causing countless kingdoms to rise and fall since then, all following this template that Gwyn set in the first cycle. Every time the flame is about to fade, someone fights their way to the kiln of the first flame and sacrifices themselves before it can fade entirely. They do this for the good of the world, supposedly. At the end of Dark Souls 2, we were just another one of these fated beings who made it to the kiln. We can choose to link the fire here and continue the order of the world, but we also learned that there are some undead powerful enough to reject light and dark entirely, to walk away from both and to try and find another path. And if none of that made sense, then you should probably watch this video where I go into more detail. And finally, we arrive at Dark Souls 3, with all these interesting lore implications hidden within the network test. First up, let's talk about the everlasting stone dragons that appear. One is living, two are dead. The one that lives can be killed, which I find a little bit strange, and the other deceased dragons are being worshipped. Hollows pray to them as their scales flake away in the wind, and there's even this area where a bunch of chairs are all arranged to face the dragon. These dragons seem out of place at first glance, but really, the idea that the ancient dragons could be coming back as an influence in the world isn't so strange. There have always been secret dragon covenants, after all. Amongst all these throwbacks to the Age of Ancients is this castle filled to the brim with hollowed soldiers and knights, so clearly the curse has already decimated civilization. The curse is at that point, just like in previous games. But most curiously, you're not one of these undead. The player character, who has always famously been teetering between humanity and hollowing, now seems completely bereft of a hollow state. You don't hollow in Dark Souls 3 from what we've seen so far. Instead, you can consume an ember to go into what's called Lord of Cinder form, where your maximum health is boosted just like consuming a humanity would do in Dark Souls 1 or 2. And we aren't the only Lord of Cinder. At the end of the demo, we find this creature, the Dancer of the Frigid Valley, she's called. When defeated, your screen reads, Heir of Fire Destroyed. That's interesting. In previous Souls games it's always been, you defeated, or victory achieved. Heir of Fire Destroyed has a much different tone to it. It actually reminds me of Bloodborne, where it says prey slaughtered, or more specifically nightmare slain, when you kill a creature or a boss that has a certain significance to your journey. And the word heir is significant to Dark Souls. It's been used before, and it was actually a word that was added to descriptions in Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. The Soul of Nishandra description from Dark Souls 2 reads, "One day the flames will fade, and only darkness will remain, unless, of course, an heir arrives. Therefore, these beings are, logically, either beings that inherited the fire at the end of a cycle, or beings that are meant to inherit it. These are creatures that inherited the fire much in the way that Gwyn did, and it's clear that our character is hunting them down, and that's really interesting. That's different from previous Souls games, that's good. I remember in an interview with Miyazaki, people questioned him about the Lord of Cinder title. A lot of people asked, "Do you mean Gwyn?" And he cryptically implied that we'll be seeing more than just Gwyn. He says if Dark Souls 1 was a story of killing a god, Dark Souls 3 is a story about killing lords. These heirs of fire, and I assume synonymously lords of cinder, are rising again. Speaking of resurrection, in the trailer a bell tolls and another Lord of Cinder rises, and this one is clearly a giant from Dark Souls 2. I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but this implies that not just humans can link the fire. This role of inheriting the fire could have fallen to the giants as well. The beginning of a cycle might just be a chance for a new race to take control, and this creature could have been a part of that. It looks so different to the dancer, the humans, and Gwyn, and it looks very similar to the Giant Lord, which was also the only giant in Dark Souls 2 that wielded a sword, so there's a lot of connections there. If you consume an ember, you go into Lord of Cinder form, which well implies that you might be an heir of fire too. And as one final note, it's off on a bit of a tangent again, but we've heard a lot about the rumoured bonfire sacrifice mechanic, whereby you can sacrifice what looks like a corpse and create a bonfire. And this reminds me a lot of what Gwyn did when he linked the fire. You know, he sacrificed himself to create more flame, so the bonfire sacrifice mechanic might be related to that. But back to the original question, which was, what part of the timeline are we in? All of this indicates that it's a sequel to previous games, and to me, it looks like we're at an extreme end of the cycle. Something fairly significant is happening for heirs of fire to rise again, for the dragons to return, and for a few screenshots to show the abyss trying to take over as well. It's almost like everything is fighting for control. So is this the very beginning of a cycle, or is it the very end? In our interview with Miyazaki, he mentioned that the game takes place in a post-apocalyptic world, and that we'll see the faded, elegant beauty of past civilizations. I thought his choice of words was interesting. An apocalypse is an event of mass destruction, and the most apocalyptic event I can think of is the fire being linked, as characters like the Emerald Herald and Strayed say that souls will flourish anew, and that a new kingdom is going to be born, and it's going to sport a new face. If this is a world immediately post the fire being linked, you know, a post-apocalyptic world, then it could explain why a lot of the world seems covered in ash as well. But I do think there's more evidence to the contrary. I don't think this looks like a world where the flame is all-powerful, so I don't think it's a world immediately after the fire has been linked. It's clearly a world where only embers remain, and...
Yes, indeed. As they say on pilgrimage, the fire fades, and the lords have no thrones.
The lords have no thrones. The word throne has a lot of significance if you've played Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 2, the Throne of Want at the end was clearly in the shape of a kiln, and was meant to represent that he who sat upon it had the power to reshape the world, and could sacrifice themselves to linking the fire. If the Lords of Cinder, presumably, have no thrones, then it follows that they're struggling to link the fire at the end of this cycle, and this lines up with a few things. The world of Dark Souls 3 looks tired and grey. Hollows pray to the trees and the dragons, and some hollows even appear to have become trees. I have this theory bouncing around in my head that these hollows are just wishing for a return to a grey age, where nothing lived and nothing died. The world just looks so much like it wants release. But this is just speculation. There's also the concept of pilgrimage, which is a familiar one in Dark Souls. Pilgrimage in these games has always been a holy journey of fateful significance. In Dark Souls 1, undead were funneled towards Lordran following the rumour of freedom from the curse. Which, when you think about it, was a convenient excuse for going on pilgrimage, since manipulative serpents like Karth and Frampt wanted undead to go on pilgrimage so they could push them towards Gwyn. So if undead are coming to this land in pilgrimage, maybe it's in that same desperate attempt to link the fire once more. And so I do think it's most logical that there's this big push to link the fire. And you know what's interesting about that? What's really cool is that the idea that the lords have no thrones probably isn't helped by the fact that we're actually hunting down these heirs of fire. Which leads us to our player character. What are our motivations in this game? As mentioned before, the player character doesn't hollow in the network test. Additionally, the humanity item appears to have been replaced by these embers, which are shaped suspiciously like humanity sprites, except they're infused with fire. And that's not incredibly strange when you think about it. Fire and dark have always been intertwined. Scholar of the First Sin even changed the Bow of Want description to clarify that light and dark are two sides of the same coin. It also changed the Chime of Want description to clarify that fragments of dark seek monarchs of light to attach themselves to. And we always offered humanity to a bonfire to become human in Dark Souls 1, so it's not so strange that these two themes, fire and dark, are inseparable here, just like the embers. One of the things I'm fascinated by most, though, is the fact that we don't hollow, particularly because hollowing was one of those things that we conquered in Dark Souls 2. By uniting the three crowns of lords long past, you no longer hollow upon death. Now, this isn't to say that our Dark Souls 2 character cured the curse, rather it means that somehow possessing these crowns overcomes that force that makes you hollow. And it's worth talking about those crowns that stop our character from hollowing in Dark Souls 2, not just because our character in Dark Souls 3 doesn't seem to hollow, but also because there's this crown shown in the cinematic trailer, and if you look really closely, you'll even see the dark sign swirling within this crown, and the dark sign is the sign of the undead that marks them as cursed, and marks them as beings doomed to hollow. It makes me wonder if maybe this represents how the crown contains the curse of the undead, and it makes me wonder who's picking up this crown, who's putting it on, and lastly it makes me wonder if this crown has the power of the crowns from Dark Souls 2, where lack of hollowing could make us unlike any undead that's come before us. And this brings me to my conclusion. The truth is, obviously, I don't know what's going to happen at the end of Dark Souls 3, even with these clues, but I'm going to make an estimated guess, just like I hope many of you guys do in the comments that you write. And my theories, as always, aren't necessarily more correct than anyone else's. Maybe someone will contradict me and come up with something even better. That would be awesome. I think that in Dark Souls 1, Gwyn committed the first sin, which was linking the fire. What he linked the fire to is the big question, and the answer I think that fits most is that he linked it to humanity. It explains why humanity is linked to the fate of the flame, where they weren't supposed to be before. Aldia calls man's life after this point a lie, a construction, and a facade, and yet a world full of warmth and resplendence. Humanity literally starts to feed the bonfires with humanity. They're bound to them, and they're unable to die as a result. The soul of Nishandra tells us that one day the flames will fade, and that only dark will remain, unless, of course, an heir arrives, and an heir always does arrive. Even in the midst of dark, like we see in Dark Souls 2, a determined and potentially manipulated undead always finds his way to the kiln. It's the only way mankind can be released from the curse, according to characters like Karth and the Emerald Herald. These are characters that guide you and motivate you and fill you with determination you need to acquire souls and link the fire and, supposedly, save the world. You're this undying force, remember, as long as you have the determination not to go hollow. The undead reaches the throne, the flame is bolstered, souls flourish anew, and everything plays out again. Mind you, everyone talks about cycles a lot as if they're unavoidable, as if the Age of Dark can never come to pass because the world is stuck in a cycle, but we don't know this for certain. The narrator in Dark Souls 1's prologue says, "One day the flame will fade, and only dark will remain," and she makes it sound like an inevitability. If we can take any character at their word, it's probably the all-knowing narrator, right? Even if countless kingdoms have risen and fallen, even if the flame has been linked hundreds of times, what if, during one age, no heir of fire answers the call? What if a character like Nishandra actually did a half-competent job of keeping undead out of the kiln? It's possible an Age of Dark could still come. It's possible a true Age of Dark hasn't been seen yet. Don't rule that possibility out. Aldia tried to find another way out of the cycle. He tried to surpass it, to go beyond light and dark, since both of them are linked. He experimented on giants, he created a dragon that gave birth to the Herald, but even the Herald herself says that all attempts to overcome the curse failed. At the end, Aldia appears. Disfigured by his experiments, he's hopeless, and he watches as we walk away from the throne towards this uncertain future. Beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark, what could possibly await us, and yet we seek it insatiably. Cue Dark Souls 3. I get the impression that the world is tired, unable to move on. Perhaps the fire hasn't been linked in a very long time, since apparently only embers remain. And I wonder if it's like this because of our player character. If we're hunting down heirs of fire, perhaps we're trying to let the world finally progress into an Age of Dark. That would line up with the "Embrace the Darkness" tagline that Dark Souls 3 has on the website. Maybe the world will finally move on, and Lords of Cinder will come back in a desperate attempt to stop that from happening. Or maybe we're opposed to darkness as well. After all, we are infused with embers, we rely upon and covet the flame because of what Gwyn did to us. This is what we are now. We're a fusion of dark and fire is a part of us. Perhaps we're still seeking that unknown goal of Dark Souls 2's final ending, where we want to discover what lies beyond light, what lies beyond dark, and we need to take a leap of faith, and no heir of fire and no spawn of darkness should stand in our way.